Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler. Now, Tim Cook is stepping down as the CEO from Apple after a 15-year run at the top of the world's biggest, richest tech company to be replaced by John Ternus, the current head of hardware engineering. Well, what does it mean for Apple? And what is Tim Cook's legacy? Did he bring in exciting new products? Or did he just play it safe, making things just into a commercial iPhone factory kind of a deal? How will history judge him on the geopolitical stage, from China to Trump? Well, here to discuss things in the round, I'm joined by Patrick McGee, who is a journalist with many august organs, including the Financial Times, the Free Press, the New York Times, and also the author of Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. Patrick, we're no strangers to Tim Cook here in the Irish Independent or in Dublin. I've interviewed him several times. In fact, he was in this building. You're talking to us here in Dublin. He was in this building in Talbot Street, a very posh part of Dublin, and caused panic because when he came into the building, we realized that almost nobody uses Macs in the building. So the word went out throughout the building. If anyone has an iPhone or an iPad, please bring it in and plonk it on your desk, because Tim was going to be doing a tour of all of the desks before he sat down for an interview and an editorial board with us. So cue everybody bringing in iPhones and iPads and their mother's iPhones and old iPhones to plonk down on the desk. But Let's just start with basics of Tim Cook and why he might be leaving now. Is it his time? He's 15 years in the job.
Really great question. I mean, I would love to know if, in fact, he's being pushed aside in some way. I don't know that we'll ever find that out. But let me just give the stars align answer, which is that he's 65 years old. That's sort of a perfect time to move on.
Mm.
He's, of course, not retiring like en masse or whatever. He's becoming executive chairman. The current executive chairman is 75, so sort of a great time to leave that role. And the incoming CEO, John Ternus, is 50. And if you want him to run a 15-year term, which is basically what Steve Jobs and Tim Cook have done, then you want a 50-year-old who can be there till he's 65. So I don't know that it deserves any more explanation than that.
Mm.
But when the Financial Times, sort of my colleagues with no help from me, had a scoop last year in November that Apple had accelerated its successionist timeline and that Cook would be resigning or announcing it in the first half of this year, that was almost a mocked story. It was certainly widely disbelieved, and I think that still does demand an explanation, because Tim Cook has said things like, "Apple is my whole life. I have no desire to ever leave." These are sort of things he says. So it's like, well, if he's still healthy, which I think we believe he is, why is he leaving? Which I think just opens the door to well, maybe someone's kind of pushing him out. And the pushing him out narrative would have some oomph to it, let me just say, which is that there's two things that Apple needs to do, and both of them are 10 to 20-year efforts. AI is probably the most obvious one. If Apple is going to really sort of have a great AI strategy, Tim Cook could be the guy who starts it, but he's clearly not going to be the person that sees it through if it's going to take 10 to 15 years. So you might as well have some young blood at the company take over. The other one, which is more idiosyncratic to me, is I think Apple's vast consolidation into China needs to be unlearned and undone to some degree, right? And that too is going to take 10 to 20 years. So why don't we have someone who is not the architect of that strategy playing the role in diversification?
They're both fascinating theories, and we are going to get into the China stuff a little bit longer, because that is, after all, a good dollop of your expertise. You've literally written a book on it. There are a few people who know more about it than you. John Ternus, his successor. I saw one theory from one of your colleagues, Mark Gurman in Bloomberg, suggesting that maybe the reason to replace the CEO now was to give the new guy in a chance because of a folding iPhone in September and the big bang of a product that would produce, and that because he's the engineering guy, that this was going to plaster his face all over a new product.
So Tim Cook has clearly been successful in taking the products that had emerged under Steve Jobs' tenure and then basically globalizing them, iterating them on an annual cycle, and sort of taking up, 20% market share, but really like the richest quintile of people on the planet own iPhones. And they sell what, 230 million iPhones a year, and that's only half the business. So, in a certain sense, Tim Cook is just like a master of operations and supply chain, and has done, in a sense, anything and everything that he needed to do, succeeding, probably the greatest product visionary of the last century. Apple, however, and Tim Cook in particular, have been hammered for this entire 15 years for not coming out with some great new product that is like a new operating platform. If the Apple Car had been a success, you would notch that under Tim Cook's leadership, but of course, it never even reached the prototype level. And if Vision Pro had been a success, then you'd have to say Tim Cook developed a new platform. That's the spatial computer headset that I personally bought and thought I would write the book in, and took it back after 6 days because the thing was useless.
Giant cranial strap-on.
Yeah, just it's an engineering marvel, but there's no content. There's just there's no partnerships. Among the things that Steve Jobs was really good at, like think about the iPod and the original iTunes store, was getting a vast network of partners on board to sort of see his vision through. And that's just not Tim Cook's skill set. He's actually sort of like he's less of a win-win partnership guy and more of a Apple takes all guy.
Are we being totally fair to him there, though? Because I mean, you might say, you wouldn't call it a platform, but Apple Watch is a massive product that came out under his watch. The AirPods, massive product, came out under his watch.
Yeah, no, that's true. And the AirPods, I believe, actually bring in more revenue than the iPod did at its peak, which is kind of a mind-blowing statistic. Yeah, neither of those are platforms. They're adjacent, they're accessories, even within Apple's own terminology, to the iPhone. But I would still give him credit for that. Absolutely. I just mean that, fair or not, the reputation of Tim Cook or the last 15 years of Apple is that they've sort of lost their creative cool in coming up with something totally new. I mean, I personally don't really even watch the annual presentations anymore because they're pre-recorded. There's no sense of surprise. I think they're kind of dull and boring. And so I think Apple, in wanting to have John Ternus come out and sort of immediately, the first act he will do is show, a new foldable iPhone. I think Apple is being really savvy here and thinking we're going to get back into some of that like creative mojo, and we're going to give the first product for John Ternus to unveil, and it's going to be the first of many. And probably by 2030, they're unveiling glasses and a whole host of things. And I think they'll just sort of set in motion a totally different reputation for Apple under John Ternus than what it was under Cook.
And yet, because you wrote a piece for the New York Times, and you gave Cook this amount of due when you said that he turned the iPhone from a culture phenomenon into a financial juggernaut and transformed the company into a $4 trillion Goliath, growing its market value by $682 million per day on average for 15 years. And that by the metrics investors care about, Mr. Cook is nothing short of a rock star. And I looked at their latest, their last set of earnings, and Apple makes $1 billion of profit, not revenue, but profit every 50 hours.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And you know what's crazy about that? And I referenced this in a piece earlier in the month. Cumulatively, in the first 7 years of Steve Jobs' comeback, they made $2.1 billion in profit. Apple now makes that twice a week.
Yeah.
So, if anyone sort of underestimates the value of what Tim Cook has brought to the company financially, I mean, there's nothing better than pointing out that twice a week they're making what Steve Jobs in 7 years of one hit after another. To be fair, this is pre-iPhone. Made. I mean, so Apple is so enormous that it's actually hard to even have your brain really understand just how gargantuan this company is.
Yeah. And yet, and this is where we come to another part of his legacy, which you have been very, very interesting on. You talk about his role in the sweep of American history and how that he has a more complicated legacy. And I was struck by something you wrote for the Free Press recently. For the New York Times again. You said, if Beijing makes good on its threats to attack the island of Taiwan, a democracy that happens to produce the vast majority of the world's semiconductor chips, Mr. Cook will be remembered differently. He will be the man who not only squandered his company's future, because it's still highly dependent on China, but also handed the West's technological prowess to its biggest threat. And you said, based on my research, I'm convinced that no company has done more to enable President Xi. Since 2008, Apple has worked with suppliers to train 30 million workers, principally in China, invested hundreds of $billions, and that at one point, Apple was sending so many engineers to orchestrate production that it persuaded United Airlines to fly thrice weekly from San Francisco. arguing it would buy so many first-class seats that the route would be profitable even if the rest of the plane were empty.
Yeah, I think this really gets to my thesis in the book, which is something people don't understand. Because if I say I'm writing a book about Apple in China, people think one of two things. One, that it's a book about Apple exploiting Chinese workers, which it's not. And two, why are you blaming Apple? Aren't all hardware companies in China? Like, why single out one company? And the answer is that Apple played an instrumental role building up China's industrial prowess. In other words, when Apple moves to China in the early 2000s, they don't go there because China is offering tech competence. They go there to build the tech competence. So Apple had a certain unit and still has a certain unit called MD, Manufacturing Design. And these are the engineers who sort of take the designs that have come out of industrial design and product design. Industrial design, one associates with Johnny Ive. Product design is what John Ternus, how he earned his jobs within Apple. And MD is the division that then goes to hundreds of factories to find the suppliers that can sort of get up to Apple quality levels and ramp up to Apple quantities. And so they did this for every product with hundreds of factories. And the result was really just like pouring the secret Apple sauce into entire industrial clusters, training up millions of workers around the way. And, it's not that these companies just operated beyond their perceived abilities. They operated above their actual capabilities because Apple would install in the aggregate, billions of dollars worth of machinery, teach them how to use it and tag it for Apple use only. So, I think the China as industrial juggernaut story is actually pretty inseparable from Apple going there in the early 2000s. I've compared Apple consolidating its operations there to a geopolitical event like the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so that's what the book is about.
And so you're like implicit in that, or maybe explicit, is the idea that if things go bad in China and they become more hostile to the West, issues are exacerbated now, that actually Apple will have played a malign influence in all of this, that it will have empowered and enabled a threat vector to the West.
Yeah, I mean, as biting as I can sound, my sort of biggest conclusion is that Tim Cook's legacy is unwritten, right? I'm not saying as of 2026 this guy should be written off. I call him a rock star. But he made certain decisions that have enabled China's rise. And if Xi Jinping turns out to be the aberration, China sort of reverts back to someone that wants to export and import with the world and have good trade and good governance, etc., then I think you would say, oh, look at that. I mean, unexpectedly, the Washington consensus from the late 1990s that we should actually accelerate China's rise because we're going to accelerate a small L liberal democracy within the country, well then, yeah, Tim Cook would be a star. But Xi Jinping has really doubled down and tripled down on the sort of belligerent tone, authoritarian stance, if not imperial stance, over the last 12 or 13 years. Apple has had not just a front row seat, they've been a participant in this the whole time, accepting a more draconian stance within the App Store, housing iCloud user data within China in a state-owned joint venture, and so on and so forth. So I'm saying it's unwritten because I don't know the future. But Tim Cook has not done a whole lot to execute Plan B, which would be to assemble things in India, to really manufacture things in India. And so, yeah, Apple's influence on China, in China, has been absolutely enormous. And I think it remains to be seen whether or not that's actually going to end up being a good thing or a bad thing.
A related point on his legacy, and you've hinted at it there, and it's Tim Cook's propensity to, at key moments, prioritize shareholder interests. Now, you could make an argument, and maybe we'll get onto this, maybe we won't, about, Trump and golden statues and attending, the premiere for the movie of Melania. And I think a very cold, hearted, cold-headed analysis of that might be that is just shareholder value. He is doing what a lot of big corporate tech CEOs believe they need to do to defend shareholder value, to make sure that their companies are not disadvantaged. Right now, back to China. I've heard Tim Cook say before, not to me, but to in other interviews, that in China, with regard to machine engineers, specific type of machine engineers, one of the reasons they were in China was simply because whether they needed to train them or whether they were there already from universities, there were simply 10x or 100x more of them in China than there were in the US. And that whether or not it led to a potential future where China would outskill the US maybe wasn't Apple's problem. It was a shareholder value proposition that they would make more iPhones and increase shareholder value. He didn't say that, but that was maybe the calculation he was making.
Yeah, I would say two things. One is that historically, I don't think Apple is whatsoever to blame for moving its operations to Asia in general and to China specifically in the late 90s and early 2000s. There was an American consensus that that was a fine thing to do. And frankly, Apple had to do it out of financial desperation. Had they not moved to Asia in late 1990s, Apple would be bankrupt. We certainly wouldn't be talking about them. I mean, simple as that. The difference is that Apple really doubled down after 2012 when Xi Jinping came to power and sort of made it clear that Apple wasn't going to be accepted in the country unless it started doing things, quote, in China for China. This was around the same period that Tim Cook, relatively new as CEO, decided to start rewarding shareholders with share buybacks and dividends, something that Steve Jobs had never done and frankly was against. The amount that Apple buys back its own shares is in excess of $100 billion a year. It's roughly equivalent to all buybacks from seven biggest banks on Wall Street. So again, hard to comprehend just how large Apple is. I think if half of that figure had been going into forming industrial clusters in India, or let's just call it building resiliency into the supply chain, you could be training people in India so that they could have a similar number, at least half the number of tool and die engineers, which is sort of the quote that you're referring to from Tim Cook in 2017. So I'm not one of these people who thinks you could have been doing this in Pittsburgh. That's nonsense. But India has lower wages and frankly more people than China. If Apple was sort of really concerned and caring about its supply chain resiliency, they would absolutely have not just all eggs in one basket, that basket being a surveillance state. And so I think that's where Tim Cook has his biggest oversight. In a certain sense, from the beginning of pitching the book, it was how did the company that clearly built the world's most sophisticated supply chain make the rookie and calamitous mistake of putting its eggs all in one basket?
Mm. Do you think he actually liked or likes Donald Trump?
No. I mean, no, not at all. I mean, Tim Cook, whatever you think of him, and he's certainly a savvy operator. But if you look at the things he's outspoken about, they're all liberal causes, right? Gay rights, the environment, gun control. Through and through, these are things that would just make him, in a sense, a typical California liberal. So he's clearly had to accede to Trump as president two times over, rather than, let's say, a Mark Zuckerberg or an Elon, where I think they really have had a genuine, change of heart. It's not just political calculus. I think they've sort of veered to the right in a way that I don't think.
Or Sergey Brin.
Yeah, well, we got to make this current, right? So Sergey Brin, yeah, exactly. I don't think Tim Cook is like that, but I also don't know what's in his heart of hearts, and he's a pretty private guy that doesn't speak much. And frankly, when he does speak, he speaks like a politician. You really can't get like a genuine answer.
Do you know what I found him, because I've interviewed him a few times and a couple of times in person, and I found him to be one of the least bullshitty type of tech CEOs. Like, you talk to somebody like Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, and it's just all jargon. It's just nonstop tech jargon. You're falling asleep after 5 minutes. Even if you only have, say, 10 minutes and you've got two hot questions. You're asking the hot questions. You're asleep after 30 seconds of the first question. It's that bad. He's a really bad interviewee. Been with Zuckerberg. He is, you wouldn't fall asleep listening to him, but he's quite robotic, and he's very pre-prepared, and he's not fully there with you. To be fair to Cook listens to your question. He might answer from a talking point, but he won't. And he will answer the question in the way that you have framed it. And sometimes he'll go slightly off script. He also has that southern, that slight Alabaman habit. He's slightly slow drawl, but not a folksy, not an affected one. I actually found him to be one of the more the least fake CEO interviewees.
So I would disagree just in that, just put interviews to the side for a second. If you just go through his feed on X, it is nothing but, happy birthday, Malala.
Does he even write that? I mean, I'm not talking, that's just corporate, and that's LinkedIn style nonsense.
Yeah, but it's so much of that.
Yeah.
And I find that he's a politician's politician, and that he answers the question that he sees fit to answer. He never really presents himself as vulnerable. My favorite sort of Steve Jobs moment, if you will, that you can find on YouTube is before he's become CEO, but he is back at Apple. It's 1997, and he just freely answers questions. I think he's got 4 bottles of water beside him,
Yeah.
and for 45 minutes, he just answers any conceivable question, and it's deeply honest and vulnerable. Now, look, Apple's in a very different state now, and so perhaps I'm sort of nostalgic for something that one shouldn't expect. But I don't think Tim Cook has that sort of freewheeling ability to just like discuss things as they are. I think he's sort of overcoached, overproduced.
Yeah. If this were a longer podcast, this would make for an interesting discussion. But because I have a couple of other examples in mind just from personal interviews. But what do we think about John Ternus then? Again, I've had luckily managed to interview him. He came to Cork 18 months ago. Managed to sit down to him. Ironically, that week that he came, there had been a news story suggesting that he was on a short list to replace Tim Cook as CEO.
Yeah.
So 2 or 3 of us got to sit down with him because he was visiting Apple's massive operation in Cork. And of course, number one on our question list is, so what's it like to be the heir apparent? And he was pretty gracious, and he was, all of that sort of stuff. He seemed to be fairly impressed, fairly, a bit of a boy wonder, but fairly innocuous.
Yeah.
Was able to push back on things. One of the things that I challenged him on was iPad battery life. One of the new iPads had come out. They had just made it much thinner. My point was, why did you make it thinner when you could have made the battery longer? Where you're making the MacBook batteries nice and long. Give me a longer iPad Pro battery. And he was like, sorry, no, thinner is better, and that's my choice. So there you go. If you don't like it,
Yeah, he would acknowledge the trade-off in a way that I don't think Tim Cook would, actually.
Yeah.
Look, the first thing I would say about John Ternus is you just get the sense that he's a normal guy. Like he sort of looks at the camera sometimes in some of Apple videos the way that like Jim in the American Office would.
He does look a bit like Jim in the American Office. Yeah.
Well, just like the knowing glance, like as if like you're in communication. I think he sort of has just normal guy vibes, which I really appreciate.
But he's got that all-American chin. That jawline.
Yeah.
What do they call it? Looks maxing in the States. Is that what they call it?
I don't know. You're talking to a Canadian. I don't know.
Sorry.
But look, the other thing is that, like, this is an engineer who, even when he's not in his job, he's sitting around tinkering with things. I spoke to a bunch of people who worked with him in the last couple of weeks, and one of the people said that he races in his spare time and he tinkers with go-karts. So he will take the aluminum chassis of his go-kart, replace it with titanium, and sort of then measure the effects. Perhaps both analytically but also driving it. And I just like the idea of a tinkerer. You sort of get back to the earliest roots of Steve Wozniak at Apple in a garage in 1976, sort of building a circuit board. I think within what Apple is today, John Ternus is the closest to that sort of guy. And, nothing more needs to happen in terms of the supply chain, in terms of it being the juggernaut that it is. Sabi Khan, who's now the COO, has been at Apple since 1995. Like, by having Tim Cook step down, it's not like you have to have concerns about what the supply chain is going to be. So I think having a guy who's fundamentally a hardware engineer who came out of taking orders from Johnny Ive, which meant sort of taking impossible designs and then figuring out how to actually make them real before passing them on to the supply chain guys. I think that's kind of a perfect fit for the next CEO. My big open question is he genuinely going to be allowed to be the CEO? What I mean by that is Tim Cook isn't retiring. He's becoming executive chairman. Let's say 3 months into his term, there's a crisis involving supply chain, a crisis involving China, something where Tim Cook is clearly the expert. Does John Ternus get to make that decision? Now, you're not going to have a problem if, in fact, they have the same instinct. But what if their instincts are different? I don't see Tim Cook sort of very easily relinquishing control. Of course, he's giving the talking point that he is that person, but he's still young and healthy. And again, his own words, has no life outside of Apple. I just don't see him allowing someone to destroy his legacy if that's how he saw it. And I think so much of what John Ternus has to do is continue parts of Tim Cook's legacy, but undo other parts. And if he's not sort of a fully functioning, distinct, autonomous CEO, that worries me. It's John Scully versus Steve Jobs 2.0.
Wow, John Scully. That's okay. That frames it in a very, very. So John, our listeners will remember John Scully, the ex-Pepsi guy, who's now kind of widely regarded as the sort of the fairly lame successor to Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Um,
Although, to be fair, I'm not talking about his 10-year legacy. I'm
yeah,
talking about there was a crisis of who was the real CEO in 1985, and it resulted in Steve Jobs' ouster.
yeah.
That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. That is a fascinating analysis. And just finally, what do you think we can expect from Apple 3.0? So we are clearly going to get a folding phone this September. It really does look like it. And you've alluded to maybe glasses over the next couple of years. Do you think we will come back to this idea of kind of innovation, more sparky products?
I don't have the evidence for it. I just have a hope and a boy's dream that we do, because who doesn't want to see Apple return to that a little bit? And I would say when I sort of look at Apple today, if you sort of accept that they've lost some of their creative mojo and so forth, the question is, well, is that a result of Tim Cook? That to rise through the ranks in Tim Cook's Apple is to be someone that kind of falls into line and has a risk aversion built into their DNA and so forth? Or is it just the nature of the beast that this company is just so big in the same way that a speedboat can pivot really quickly and the Titanic cannot? Is it just that? And I don't have any dogma on there. It's not clear to me which it is. But the worry, of course, is that if it's actually just that they're so big that it's not really a company that can really experiment wildly with the iPhone because they're going to build them in the tens of millions, then that's not something John Ternus can change. That's just the nature of the beast.
Mm.
So that would be, in a sense, what I think will be interesting, and reporters will have some fun the next couple of years, sort of figuring that out. So time's going to tell. I don't have some great prediction, but I guess my biggest worry is that the financial success of Apple is actually masking some pretty big problems underneath. And it's difficult to really pinpoint those problems because they're being so successful. But there's been a real loss of talent over the last few years, a certain sense of brain drain. And the sort of creative types, I think, have more or less been pushed out of the company. I mean, I can't get these people to speak on record, but I talk to these people all the time, and they just say, like, it's like the risk-taking thing that we did in the 2000s just was no longer acceptable in the penny-pinching organization under Tim Cook. And so I don't know that that's really going to come back. The other thing I would say, just the last point, is that John Ternus has just been made CEO. But if you remember, late last year, Apple made a whole host of changes that, in a certain sense, I feel like have already decapitated his ability to make major personnel changes. In other words, we just got a new COO, a new chief lawyer. They got rid of the chief of AI. Johnny Shruji, who's just been made the chief hardware officer, is more or less John Ternus's replacement, but in an elevated role. So my point is that usually you expect a new CEO to come in and maybe clean house, right? And appoint a bunch of people that report to him that are new. He's not really going to be in a position to do that because Apple's already made those changes. What I don't know is whether he was sort of in on those decisions from the get-go, or whether, in a certain sense, they've constrained his ability to actually make fundamental changes
Yeah.
already.
Well, I guess when you're the CEO, it's not just that you're placed there and you have to go with the system. You've got to be the one who actually fights and makes the company in your own image as well. I mean, that's what Jobs did to an extent. That's what Cook did, I suppose, over his period. And that's what Ternus is going to have to do now. If he wants his own company, he's going to have to put his elbows out.
And anyone who's talked to people who knows Turnis is he's not an elbows out kind of guy. A great Canadian hockey term, by the way.
Yeah.
He is calm, collegial, and a team player. Look, and again, maybe that's fine. But if a certain crisis hits, you might want a wartime CEO, and John Ternus might be the ultimate peacetime CEO.
Interesting. We're definitely going to see which of that is the case. But anyway, Patrick McGee, absolutely fascinating discussion. I was delighted to have you on the podcast. The author of Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. On sound today was Gav Hennessy, and JJ Clark produced this episode. I'm Adrian Weckler. You've been listening to or watching The Big Tech Show, and we'll talk to you soon.